I'm not your bank anymore. Get out! My mother's words sliced through the dining room like a blade, sharp enough that I felt every person at that table freeze in place, and I knew in that moment that something fundamental had shattered between us, something that could never be pieced back together the same way. I had asked to borrow $200 for groceries until my paycheck cleared on Friday. I had asked quietly, leaning toward her after dinner while everyone else laughed over coffee and dessert, thinking I could spare myself the humiliation of a public conversation about my financial situation, but Mom had other plans. "This is ridiculous, Emma," she said, her voice rising so that Aunt Marie stopped mid-sentence, and Uncle Tom's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "You're nearly 30 years old. Kyle doesn't come begging us for grocery money." The comparison stung because it was so reflexive, so automatic, the way she always measured me against my brother and found me wanting. Kyle sat across the table with his wife Brittany, both of them suddenly fascinated by their dessert plates, and I felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up my neck. I wanted to remind her that I had paid back the last loan in 3 months, that Kyle still owed them $15,000 from his last failed business venture, that I had never asked them for anything until 6 months ago when my building went condo and I needed help with the security deposit. I wanted to say all of that, but the words stuck in my throat because I could see Grandma Ruth looking at me with something like pity, and Aunt Marie's expression had shifted to embarrassed concern, and I realized that nothing I said would matter because this wasn't really about $200. "I've given and given to you your entire life," Mom continued, and I could hear the years of resentment in her voice. Resentment I had never understood, because I had spent my 20s working myself to exhaustion, putting myself through community college, building a career as an architect, one grueling project at a time while Kyle received everything handed to him on a silver platter. "I'm not your bank anymore. Get out!" The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood up slowly, my legs somehow steady, even though my hands were shaking, and I reached for my coat on the back of my chair. "Emma, wait," Aunt Marie started, but I was already moving toward the door, and I didn't look back at any of them. Not at my father, who sat silent as always. Not at Kyle, who had never once defended me. Not at my mother, whose face I knew would show no regret for what she had just done. I walked out into the November cold and got into my car, and only when I was 3 blocks away did I let myself cry. But even through the tears, something else was building inside me, something harder and clearer than hurt. This was the moment everything changed, though none of them knew it yet. The pattern of favoritism started long before that dinner, stretching back through my entire childhood like a thread of poison woven into the fabric of our family, and I could trace it to specific moments that had calcified in my memory with perfect clarity. Kyle was 2 years older than me, and from the time I was conscious enough to notice, I understood that he occupied a different position in my mother's heart, a position I could never reach no matter what I accomplished or how hard I tried to earn her approval. When Kyle graduated high school with a 2.8 GPA and got accepted to State University, my parents paid his full tuition, $53,000 over 4 years, plus they bought him a used Honda Civic for his 18th birthday so he wouldn't have to take the bus to campus. When I graduated 2 years later, with a 3.9 GPA and a partial scholarship to the same university, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table and explained that they had already stretched themselves thin with Kyle's education, and perhaps I should consider community college for my first 2 years to save money, and I could work part-time to cover what the scholarship didn't pay. I was 17 years old, and I remember nodding like I understood, like this made perfect sense. But inside something cracked, some fundamental belief that hard work would be rewarded equally in our family. I did go to community college, and I worked 3 jobs to pay for it, waitressing at dinner shifts, tutoring math on weekends, and doing administrative work at a dental office every morning before my afternoon classes. Kyle spent his college years joining a fraternity that my parents paid dues for, taking 6 years to finish a business degree while changing his major 4 times, and when he finally graduated, they threw him a party with 200 guests at a rented hall that cost $4,000. When I graduated summa cum laude from community college and transferred to finish my architecture degree, my mother took me to lunch at Applebee's and told me she was proud, but also asked when I was going to meet someone nice because I was spending too much time focused on school. Kyle's mediocre achievements were celebrated like Olympic victories, while my genuine accomplishments were acknowledged with the emotional equivalent of a pat on the head. And this pattern continued into our 20s with relentless consistency. When Kyle wanted to start his first business, an online retail venture that folded within 8 months, my parents invested $12,000 they never expected back. When his second business failed, a consulting company that never had a single client, they gave him another $15,000 for what he called a learning experience. When I mentioned I was saving for a down payment on a condo and asked if they had any advice about first-time home buying, my mother said real estate was a big commitment, and maybe I should wait until I was married so I would have two incomes to rely on. My father sat through all of this in his characteristic silence, nodding along with whatever my mother said, offering weak smiles that were supposed to convey sympathy, but really just showed me that he would never stand up for me, never question the fundamental unfairness of how she treated her two children. My 20s unfolded in a pattern of professional progress, shadowed by maternal disappointment. Each achievement I earned through 60-hour work weeks and relentless self-discipline somehow diminished in my mother's eyes by the fact that I remained unmarried and therefore, in her assessment, incomplete. I started as a junior architect at Morrison & Associates 3 months after finishing my degree, earning $42,000 a year in a city where rent consumed half my paycheck, but I was building something real, contributing to actual projects that changed skylines and communities, and I felt purpose in the work even when exhaustion left me barely functional. My mother's response when I told her about the job was to ask if there were any single men at the firm, and when I mentioned my boss was a 58-year-old woman named Patricia Morrison, she looked genuinely disappointed, as though I had deliberately chosen a workplace that would thwart her matrimonial ambitions for me. Kyle, meanwhile, had stumbled through 3 different sales positions in his 20s, each one presented to the family as a stepping stone to greatness, and when he met Brittany at 27, my mother acted like he had won the lottery. Brittany came from money, real money, the kind that meant she had never worked a day in her life, but spoke confidently about investments and portfolio management. And my mother was so dazzled by her designer clothes and casual mentions of the family's vacation home in Hilton Head that she practically canonized Kyle for having the good sense to marry wealth. Their wedding cost $65,000, with my parents contributing $20,000. They somehow found, despite having told me for years they were stretched thin, and I was expected to be thrilled for my brother, even as I calculated how many years of work that $20,000 represented for me. I had been in a serious relationship myself, with a man named David, who was kind and ambitious, and loved me in a way that felt solid and real. But when he was offered a research position in Geneva, 2 years into our relationship, he asked me to come with him, and I said I couldn't leave my career just when it was gaining momentum, and he went anyway. My mother's reaction was to tell me I had made a terrible mistake, that careers come and go, but finding a good man is rare, that I had let him go through my own stubborn insistence on prioritizing work over love, and her judgment of that decision hung between us like smoke, clouding every interaction we had afterward. When I was promoted to project architect at 26, a position that came with a salary increase, to $68,000 and my own team of junior designers, my mother said, "That's nice, honey," and then spent the next 20 minutes telling me about Kyle's new sales position at a medical supply company, his third job in as many years, as though his lateral career moves were somehow more impressive than my vertical climb. I stopped telling her about my professional victories after that, recognizing that she would never see them the way she saw Kyle's most basic accomplishments, never understand that while she was waiting for me to find a husband and fulfill what she saw as my primary purpose, I was building something that mattered, creating structures and spaces that would outlast all of us. The first time I asked my parents for financial help as an adult came 6 months before that nightmare dinner, and it arrived at a moment when circumstances genuinely backed me into a corner through no fault of my own. When my apartment building was sold to developers who converted it to condominiums and gave all tenants 60 days to either buy their units at market rate or vacate. I had been living in that modest one-bedroom in a decent neighborhood for 3 years, paying $1,100 a month, which was reasonable for the area, and I had been saving diligently despite my moderate salary, building an emergency fund that had reached $8,000, an amount I was genuinely proud of given how hard I had worked for every dollar. But finding a new apartment in that market meant coming up with first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit, a total of $3,300 due up front before I could move in anywhere comparable. And while I had the savings to cover it, doing so would completely wipe out my emergency fund and leave me vulnerable in a way that terrified me. So I did something I had never done before and asked my parents if they could loan me $1,500 toward the security deposit, money I promised to pay back within 3 months. My mother's response came after a long pause, during which I could hear her disapproval crackling through the phone line, and when she finally spoke, she said, "Emma, you're 27 years old, and you should have planned better for something like this. But I suppose we can help you this once, though you need to understand we can't make a habit of this." She agreed to transfer the money, but made me sign a handwritten promissory note during Sunday dinner the following week, an actual piece of paper where I wrote out the amount, the terms, and my signature, something she insisted on to keep things clear, and I signed it feeling the weight of humiliation settle over me like a heavy coat. I paid her back in full in exactly 10 weeks, transferring $500 from each of 3 paychecks and eating ramen and pasta for most of those weeks to make the payments happen. And when I made the final transfer, I felt a surge of pride that I had honored my commitment and proven I was responsible. 4 months later, I was at my parents' house when Kyle called asking for money for what he described as an incredible investment opportunity, some cryptocurrency venture his friend was launching. And I watched my mother's face light up as she listened to him explain this transparent scheme, watched her nod and smile and say, "Of course, honey, how much do you need?" When Kyle said $15,000, she didn't hesitate, didn't ask him to sign anything, didn't mention repayment terms, just said she would talk to Dad and transfer it by the end of the week. I sat there feeling my stomach turn to stone as I understood with perfect clarity that the rules that applied to me did not apply to my brother, that I could be responsible and grateful and prompt with repayment and still be treated like a risk, while Kyle could ask for 10 times as much for a scheme that was obviously doomed and be treated like a brilliant entrepreneur. And I said nothing because I had spent my entire life saying nothing, swallowing the unfairness, and hoping that eventually my good behavior would be rewarded with equal treatment. Kyle never paid back that $15,000. The investment collapsed within 6 months, as anyone with sense could have predicted. And when I carefully asked my mother months later whether he had started making payments, she looked at me like I had said something inappropriate and told me that family helps family without keeping score. What my family never knew, what I never told them during all those months when they dismissed my work as mere drafting and asked when I would find a real passion the way Kyle had supposedly found his calling in sales, was that I had been pouring every spare moment into a project that consumed me completely. A revolutionary sustainable housing design that had begun 18 months earlier as a theoretical exercise with my former professor, Dr. Chen, and had evolved into something that might actually change how we think about low-income housing in urban environments. Dr. Chen had taught my advanced design seminar in my final year at community college, and she was the first person in my educational experience who looked at my work and saw not just competence but genuine vision, who told me after reviewing my final project that I had an instinct for spatial efficiency and human-centered design that could not be taught, only nurtured. We had stayed in touch after my graduation, meeting for coffee every few months to discuss architecture and theory. And during one of those meetings about 2 years into my professional career, I had mentioned my frustration with a affordable housing project my firm was developing, how we were constrained by conventional thinking and cost considerations that resulted in units that were technically adequate but spiritually deadening, boxes that warehoused people rather than homes that elevated them. Dr. Chen had leaned forward with that intense focus. She brought to ideas that excited her and said we should design something better, not for a client but for ourselves, for the principle of proving it could be done, and that conversation became a partnership that took over my life in the best possible way. We worked on the design for 9 months before we had something worth submitting anywhere, meeting every Saturday morning at her office at the college, spending hours sketching and modeling and calculating, developing a modular housing system that used sustainable materials and innovative spatial design to create units that were affordable to build but felt spacious and dignified, that incorporated communal green spaces and natural light and flexibility for different family configurations. The breakthrough came when we solved the vertical integration problem, figuring out how to stack and connect the modules in ways that created community rather than isolation. And when Dr. Chen showed me the renderings of what we had created, I felt something shift in my chest. A recognition that this was the work I was meant to do. The contribution I could make that mattered beyond aesthetics or profit margins. Dr. Chen was the one who found the International Architectural Innovation Prize, a competition I had never heard of that offered a $250,000 grand prize, plus partnership opportunities with major firms for designs that advance sustainable urban development. And when she suggested we submit our housing design, I felt equal parts excitement and terror because entering meant believing our work was good enough to compete on a global stage. We submitted the application 4 months before that terrible dinner, a comprehensive package that included technical drawings, cost analyses, sustainability impact studies, and a scale model I built in my apartment over 3 weeks of late nights, spending nearly $2,000 of my own money on materials because the competition required physical models, and I believed in our design enough to invest in it, even though that money represented my entire discretionary budget for 2 months. I told no one about the submission, not my colleagues at work, not my friends, and certainly not my family, because I could not bear the thought of my mother's skeptical expression or her questions about whether this was really a good use of my time, could not risk having this thing that mattered so much to me diminished by her casual dismissal the way she had dismissed every other achievement I had worked for. And beyond that, I was genuinely terrified of failing, of having put so much hope and work into something only to have it rejected, and I decided that if we did not win or even place, I would simply never mention it, and no one would know about this dream I had dared to dream. The financial strain of funding the prototype materials and the competition entry fee was real, coming at exactly the wrong time when I was still rebuilding my savings after the apartment move, and it was that strain, that deliberate choice to invest in my own vision rather than maintain a comfortable buffer, that would eventually lead me to ask my mother for grocery money and trigger the confrontation that changed everything. The months between paying back that $1,500 loan and the explosive dinner that would finally break me were filled with small humiliations that accumulated like stones in my pocket, each one individually bearable but collectively crushing. And they began in earnest at a family dinner in early March, when my mother made what she called a joke about me being the struggling artist of the family, saying to the table with a laugh that every family needed one impractical dreamer, and she supposed that was my role. Never mind that I was not an artist, but a licensed architect, working at an established firm. And when I tried to clarify this, she waved her hand dismissively and said, "Same difference, dear, you know what I mean." And everyone laughed along with her while I sat there feeling my face burn with shame. My birthday came 3 weeks later on March 28th, and my mother forgot it entirely, not a card or a call or even a text message, and when I mentioned it casually 2 days later during our weekly phone call, she said, "Oh my goodness, Emma, I've just been so busy with planning Kyle's party, you know how it is." As if this was a reasonable explanation. And I did know how it was because Kyle's birthday celebration the following month was a catered affair at my parents' house with 40 guests, and a budget my father later mentioned was around $3,000, complete with a bartender and a photographer and a elaborate dessert display, while my birthday had merited absolutely nothing. In late April, my car made a terrible grinding sound that the mechanic diagnosed as a failing transmission, and the repair estimate came to $1,100, money I did not have readily available because I was still rebuilding my savings and had just paid the competition entry fee. So I called my mother and asked if I could borrow $500 to help cover the cost, promising as always to pay it back within weeks. And her response was an interrogation about whether I really needed the repair or if I was being upsold, whether I had gotten multiple estimates, whether I had been maintaining the car properly, a litany of questions that implied the mechanical failure was somehow my fault due to negligence or stupidity, and she finally agreed to lend me the money, but told me this really needed to be the last time because I was nearly 30 and should have better financial planning. The very next week, I was at my parents' house when my mother presented Kyle's wife, Brittany, with a designer handbag, a Chloe bag that Brittany had mentioned admiring, and when Brittany protested that it was too much, my mother said, "Nonsense, I saw it and thought of you. You deserve beautiful things." And I happen to know from having looked up that exact bag online out of curiosity that it retailed for $2,400, a just because gift that cost nearly 5 times what my mother had interrogated me about lending. And I sat there on the couch feeling invisible, feeling like I existed in a completely different category than my brother's family. A category where my needs were scrutinized and minimized while their wants were indulged and celebrated. I paid back that $500 in 3 weeks, transferring it early because I picked up extra drafting work on evenings, and my mother's acknowledgement was a brief text that said only, "Received, thanks." No recognition of the effort or the promptness, and I realized with devastating clarity that nothing I did would ever be enough to earn the casual generosity and automatic support that Kyle received simply by existing. The week that would change everything began on a Tuesday morning in late May when I arrived at work to find an email with the subject line, "IAI Prize, Finalist Notification," waiting in my inbox, and my hands actually shook as I opened it, reading the formal language that informed me I had been selected as one of 3 finalists from over 2,000 international entries for the International Architectural Innovation Prize, that my sustainable housing design had been reviewed by a panel of distinguished architects and urban planners who believed it represented a significant advancement in affordable housing methodology, and that the final winner would be announced at a public ceremony in Chicago in exactly 4 weeks, on June 27th. I sat at my desk reading and rereading those words, feeling something massive expanding in my chest, a combination of pride and terror and disbelief, and I had to close my office door and just breathe for 10 minutes before I could compose myself enough to call Dr. Chen, who answered on the first ring and screamed so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear, and we talked for nearly an hour about what this meant. How even if we did not win the grand prize, the recognition of being a finalist was enormous, how this would open doors professionally that we had not dared to imagine. The email included strict instructions that finalists were not to publicly discuss their status until the official announcement 4 weeks hence, when all 3 finalists would be revealed simultaneously to the press and industry publications, and this confidentiality requirement meant I could not tell my family even if I had wanted to. Though the truth was that in that moment of triumph, my first instinct was not to share the news with my mother, but to protect it from her, to keep this fragile, precious thing safe from her dismissal, or her ability to make it somehow about Kyle, or her inevitable questions about whether this was really as important as it seemed. That same week, On Thursday evening, I received a text in the family group chat from Kyle that said, "Bad news, got let go today, going to crash at mom and dad's for a while to figure things out." And within minutes, the chat exploded with supportive messages. My mother writing, "Oh, honey, we're here for you, whatever you need. These companies don't appreciate loyalty anymore." And my father adding, "Your room is ready anytime." And I stared at my phone thinking about how this was the third job Kyle had lost in 4 years, how each time the narrative was about companies failing to recognize his value rather than any examination of his performance, and how the support being offered to him was immediate and unconditional and generous in exactly the ways that support for me never was. By Sunday, I was down to eating rice and canned vegetables because I had been surviving on a severely restricted budget since paying for the competition materials. And when my mother called that afternoon to tell me about Kyle's situation in more detail, to explain that he and Brittany were having some tension because of the job loss and he needed family support, she mentioned they were having a family dinner on Tuesday to boost Kyle's spirits, and I said I would be there, even though I knew I could not afford to bring an expensive host gift, and I was living on $40 until payday on Friday, and I made the mistake of thinking that surely at this dinner, with Kyle's problems taking center stage once again, someone might notice that I had been quiet lately, that I looked tired and thin, that I might also need support, not understanding yet that my needs would always be invisible next to Kyle's wants, that the dinner I agreed to attend would become the site of my final humiliation and the catalyst for everything that would follow. I arrived at my parents' house on Tuesday evening at 6:30, parking on the street because Kyle's car and Brittany's BMW were already in the driveway alongside my aunt and uncle's sedan, and I sat in my car for a long moment looking at the warm lights glowing in the windows and feeling the weight of the gift I had brought for Kyle. A framed architectural sketch of our childhood home that I had drawn from memory over the course of 3 evenings, spending hours getting the details right. The specific angle of the roofline and the oak tree in the front yard, and the bay window where we used to sit on Christmas mornings, all rendered in careful pen and ink and matted in a simple frame that had cost me $20 I could not really afford. I walked up to the front door carrying this gift and feeling anxious in a way I could not quite name, and my mother answered before I could knock, her face bright with the particular animation she always had when hosting family gatherings, and she looked at the wrapped frame in my hands and said, "Oh, Emma, you made it. Come in. Everyone's already here." Not asking what I had brought or greeting me with any warmth, just ushering me inside where I found the living room, full of people, Aunt Marie and Uncle Tom on the couch, Grandma Ruth in the armchair by the window, Kyle and Brittany standing by the fireplace holding wine glasses and looking like a catalog photograph of successful young marrieds. Kyle came over and hugged me, and I handed him the gift, saying it was for his birthday, even though his actual birthday had been in April and this was nearly June, and he opened it right there in front of everyone, tearing the wrapping paper to reveal the sketch, and there was a brief moment when his face showed genuine surprise and what might have been appreciation before my mother leaned over his shoulder and said, "Oh, that's sweet, Emma. Very crafty," in a tone that made the word crafty sound like a euphemism for cheap. And then Brittany held up her wrist to show the sleek silver watch she was wearing and said, "Kyle got me this Cartier for our anniversary. Isn't it gorgeous?" And my mother immediately gushed about how thoughtful and generous Kyle was, how Brittany deserved to be spoiled. And my framed sketch was set aside on the side table without further comment. We moved to the dining room where my mother had prepared an elaborate meal, roast chicken and 3 side dishes and fresh bread, and the conversation throughout dinner revolved entirely around Kyle's situation, everyone offering sympathy and advice about his job loss, my father saying the company had clearly made a mistake, Aunt Marie sharing a story about someone she knew who had been fired and then found an even better position, Uncle Tom suggesting Kyle take some time to really figure out what he wanted before rushing into the next opportunity. And through all of this, Kyle nodded and accepted the support with the ease of someone who had never doubted he deserved it. while I sat at my usual spot near the end of the table, eating quietly and saying nothing, because I had learned years ago that my contributions to these conversations were generally ignored or redirected. I had eaten very little in the past 3 days, mostly rice and the last of some canned soup, and despite my complicated feelings about being there, I found myself grateful for the food, taking small portions because I did not want to appear greedy but feeling genuine hunger that I had been trying to ignore. And as I ate, I carried in my chest the secret knowledge of the competition, of being a finalist, of the ceremony just 3 weeks away, and the contrast between that hidden achievement and my position at this table, as the forgotten daughter, felt almost absurd, like I was living in two completely different realities simultaneously. After dinner, we moved back to the living room for coffee and the elaborate birthday cake my mother had ordered from the expensive bakery on Main Street. A 3-layer chocolate creation that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. And everyone sang happy birthday to Kyle, even though his birthday had been 6 weeks ago, and he blew out the candles while Brittany took photos on her phone, and I sat on the edge of the couch drinking coffee and feeling the slight relief of having food in my stomach, but also the growing anxiety about my situation, about the $40 in my checking account, and the 3 days until payday, and the fact that I had no food at home except rice and 2 cans of beans. I waited until the cake had been served and eaten, until the conversation had shifted to Grandma Ruth telling a long story about her neighbor's grandson. And then I stood up and walked quietly to the kitchen where my mother was rinsing dessert plates, and I said in a voice I tried to keep casual and low, "Mom, can I talk to you for a second?" She turned from the sink with a dish in her hands and said, "What is it, Emma?" And I felt my face get hot as I said, "I was wondering if I could borrow $200 until Friday, just for groceries. I'll pay you back as soon as I get paid." The change in her expression was immediate, her face hardening in a way I knew too well, and she set the dish down with enough force that I worried it might break, and said in a voice that was not quiet at all, "Are you serious right now?" I tried to keep my voice down, saying, "I just need it for a few days. I've been having some expenses, and I'm a little short until payday." And she said loud enough that I knew people in the living room could hear, "This is ridiculous, Emma. You're nearly 30 years old and you're asking me for grocery money?" I felt everyone's attention shift toward us, felt the conversation in the other room die down, and I said quietly, "I paid back the security deposit loan in 3 months. I always pay you back." And my mother cut me off saying, "That's not the point. The point is that you shouldn't need to keep borrowing money. Kyle doesn't ask us for grocery money. Kyle and Brittany have their lives together." I felt something break open inside me, and I said, "Kyle just moved back home because he lost another job." And my mother's face went red and she said, "That is completely different. He's going through a transition. He's not asking for handouts for basic necessities." And I stood there feeling the eyes of my entire family on us, feeling the familiar shame of being judged and found wanting. And then my mother said the words that I will remember for the rest of my life, her voice cold and final. "I'm not your bank anymore, Emma. Get out." The kitchen went completely silent. I heard Aunt Marie gasp from the living room doorway. I looked at my mother's face and saw no regret there, no softening, just anger, and what looked like disgust, and I felt something inside me that had been bending for years finally snap. I did not cry. I did not argue. I walked past her into the living room where everyone was staring, picked up my purse and my coat from the chair where I had left them, and headed for the front door. Aunt Marie stood up and said, "Emma, wait, honey," reaching out to touch my arm, but I pulled away gently and kept walking, and my father said, "Now hold on, let's everyone just calm down." But I was already opening the door, already stepping out into the cool evening air, and the last thing I heard before I closed the door behind me was my mother's voice saying, "She's being dramatic. She'll get over it." I drove home with tears streaming down my face and my hands shaking on the steering wheel, the humiliation of what had just happened playing over and over in my mind, like a recording I could not turn off. My mother's voice saying, "Get out," in front of everyone I was related to. The looks on their faces, the pity in Aunt Marie's eyes, and the silence from my father, who had said nothing to defend me. And I made it to my apartment building and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes crying until I had no tears left, and something strange began to happen inside me. The hurt began to transform into something else. Anger. Clean, clarifying anger that burned away the shame and left something harder in its place. I walked up to my apartment and sat on my couch in the dark, and I thought about the pattern I had been living in for my entire life. This cycle of trying to earn love that was never going to be freely given, of watching my brother receive everything while I received scraps and criticism, of performing and achieving and working myself to exhaustion for people who would never see my worth because they had decided years ago that I did not have any. I thought about the competition results sitting in my email inbox, about the fact that I was a finalist for one of the most prestigious architectural prizes in the world, that my design had been selected from 2,000 entries, that I had accomplished something extraordinary. And I had not told my family because some part of me knew they would find a way to diminish it, or ignore it, or make it about Kyle somehow. I picked up my phone, and I blocked my mother's number. Then I blocked Kyle's number, then Brittany's. I left my father unblocked because some small part of me wanted to give him one chance, one opportunity to call me and apologize and acknowledge what had happened, and I waited to see if he would take it. 2 days passed, and he did not call. On the third day, he sent a text message that said, "Your mother is very upset. You know how she is. Maybe give her some time to cool down and then you two can talk." I stared at that message for a long time. You know how she is. As if her cruelty was just a personality quirk I needed to accept, as if I was the problem for not tolerating being treated like I was worthless. I did not respond. I threw myself into work, spending every evening at my drafting table refining details of the sustainable housing design, preparing materials for the final competition presentation, coordinating with Dr. Chen, who kept telling me how proud he was of what we had created together. 2 weeks after the dinner, Aunt Marie called from a number I had not blocked, and when I answered, she said, "Emma, honey, your mother is heartbroken. She didn't mean what she said. You know she loves you. Why don't you just come to Sunday dinner and we can all move past this?" I felt that anger rise up again and I said, "Aunt Marie, I love you, but I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not apologizing for asking for help when Kyle has been given thousands of dollars he never paid back. I'm not pretending that what happened was okay. I'm done." She tried to argue, tried to tell me that family was family, and I needed to be the bigger person, and I hung up on her. I had spent 28 years being the bigger person, bending and accommodating and swallowing hurt, and I was finished. 3 weeks after the dinner, I was at my desk at work reviewing blueprints for a client project when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, a Chicago area code. And I almost did not answer because I had been getting occasional calls from family members using different phones trying to get through to me. But something made me pick up, and the voice on the other end said, "Is this Emma Richardson?" And I said yes, and she said, "This is Catherine Morales from the International Architectural Prize Committee. I'm calling with news about your sustainable housing submission." My heart stopped. Everything around me seemed to go silent, even though my co-workers were talking and phones were ringing, and the office was full of its usual noise. But I could not hear any of it, could only hear the blood rushing in my ears as she said, "I'm delighted to inform you that you have been awarded second place in this year's competition. Your design was selected from over 2,000 international entries, and the judges were extremely impressed with your innovative approach to affordable, sustainable housing." I could not speak. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear and tears starting to stream down my face, and Catherine continued. "The second place prize is $100,000, and we're also pleased to offer you a featured partnership opportunity with Chen and Morrison, one of the premier sustainable architecture firms in the country." They've specifically requested to work with you on developing your design for implementation in low-income communities across the United States. I managed to say, I can't believe this. And she laughed warmly and said, Believe it, you've done extraordinary work. We'll be making the public announcement in 2 weeks, and we'd like you to attend the awards gala in Chicago, where you'll receive your prize and give a brief acceptance speech. We'll be sending you all the details by email today, along with information about press coverage and the partnership proposal. After I hung up, I sat at my desk shaking, and my supervisor Rachel walked by and stopped and said, Emma, are you okay? And I looked up at her with tears still on my face and said, I just won second place in the International IKEA Architectural Prize. And her eyes went wide, and she actually screamed. And suddenly the whole office was crowding around my desk, and people were hugging me and congratulating me, and someone opened a bottle of champagne that had been in the break room fridge since someone's birthday 3 months ago. My phone rang again, and it was Dr. Chen, and his voice was thick with emotion as he said, Emma, I just got off the phone with the committee. I am so incredibly proud of you. I always knew your vision was special, but to see it recognized like this, to know that we're going to bring this design to life and help people, this is why we do this work. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to focus on anything, reading and rereading the email from the committee with all the details about the gala ceremony at the Palmer House Hilton in Chicago, about the press releases going out to major architecture publications, about the partnership with Chen and Morrison, and what it would mean for my career. I would need to take time off work for the gala, but Rachel immediately approved it and said the firm's senior partners wanted to attend to support me, that this kind of recognition reflected well on everyone. I drove home that evening with my hands still shaking on the steering wheel, and I thought about my mother's voice saying, "Get out." And I felt something bitter and sweet mixing together in my chest. The knowledge that I had achieved something extraordinary, and the people who should have celebrated me would only find out about it when the rest of the world did. That night, I sat on my couch with my laptop open and my phone in my hand, and I stared at my mother's blocked contact, and I felt the debate raging inside me. This war between the part of me that had spent 28 years desperately wanting her approval, and the part of me that had finally learned I did not need it. And I thought about calling her, about telling her what I had achieved, about finally getting to see recognition in her eyes. But even as I thought it, I felt sick because I knew how it would go. She would find some way to diminish it, or make it about herself, or ask why I had not told her sooner. And I realized that telling her would be giving her power over something that was purely mine, this achievement that had nothing to do with her or her approval or her validation. My roommate Jordan came home around 8 and found me sitting there in the dark, and she turned on the light and said, "Why are you sitting here like a vampire?" And I told her about the prize, and she screamed and hugged me, and then I told her about the debate happening in my head, about whether I should tell my family, and she sat down across from me with her face serious and said, "Emma, I have watched your family treat you like garbage for the 3 years we've lived together. I've seen you cry after Sunday dinners. I've heard your mother on the phone telling you that you're not trying hard enough, not achieving enough, not being enough. And now you've achieved something incredible, and you're thinking about giving them the satisfaction of being the first to know?" I said, "They're still my family." And she said, "They're people who share your DNA. Family is supposed to support you and celebrate you and believe in you, and they've done none of those things. Let them find out the same way everyone else does. Let them see it in the news and realize that something extraordinary was happening in your life, and they had no idea because they never bothered to actually see you." I sat with her words, and I knew she was right, knew that reaching out to them now would be repeating the same pattern I had been trying to break, this cycle of seeking their approval and being disappointed when they could not give it. I made the decision then. I would not tell them. They would find out when the public announcement went out in 2 weeks, when my name and photo appeared in architecture publications and local news outlets, when the world could see what they had been too blind to notice. The next 2 weeks became a blur of preparation. of coordinating with the competition organizers about the gala ceremony, of working with Rachel and the senior partners at my firm who wanted to attend to support me, of shopping for a dress suitable for the awards ceremony and practicing my acceptance speech in front of my bathroom mirror. I had never been comfortable with public speaking, had always felt invisible and insignificant. But Dr. Chen worked with me on the speech, helped me find the words to express what the sustainable housing project meant to me, why I had spent years developing this design that could provide affordable, environmentally friendly homes for families who had been priced out of decent housing. I wrote and rewrote, trying to capture the passion I felt for the work without sounding preachy or self-important. And finally, I had something I felt proud of. 2 minutes that expressed my vision and thanked the people who had actually believed in me when it mattered. 3 days before the gala, the International Architectural Prize Committee released their public announcement, and suddenly my name and face were everywhere, and I watched it unfold on my laptop screen at work as Architecture Daily posted the article. Emerging architect Emma Richardson wins second place in International Sustainable Housing Competition, with a photo of me they had taken during the finalist interview I had done 2 weeks earlier, and within an hour it had been picked up by Architectural Digest, and then Dezeen, and then the local news outlets in our city started running stories with headlines like, "Local Architect Wins International Prize," and "Chicago Native Awarded $100,000 for Innovative Housing Design." My phone started buzzing with notifications from colleagues and acquaintances, people I had gone to college with and former professors and clients from work, all congratulating me, and my LinkedIn profile suddenly had dozens of connection requests from people in the industry, and my Instagram post about the win that I had scheduled to go live with the announcement was getting hundreds of likes and comments. I sat at my desk refreshing my social media feeds and watching the numbers climb and feeling this surreal mixture of pride and disbelief. And Rachel came over and hugged me and said the senior partners wanted to take me to lunch to celebrate. And I said yes, even though I felt too nervous to eat. And at lunch, they toasted me with champagne and talked about how this would raise the firm's profile and open doors for all of us. And I felt genuinely grateful to work somewhere that celebrated my achievement instead of resenting it. I got back to the office around 2 in the afternoon, and that was when everything changed, when my phone started exploding, not with congratulations from colleagues, but with notifications from my family. And I watched it happen in real time, the moment they found out. My mother called first, and the call came through even though I had her blocked, which meant she was calling from a different number, and I let it go to voicemail, and then she called again and again, 15 times in 20 minutes, and then my father started calling, and Kyle sent a text that just said, "Why didn't you tell us?" with multiple question marks like, I owed him an explanation. And then Brittany left a comment on my Instagram post that said, "Congratulations, Emma, so exciting," with emojis, and I could feel the insincerity dripping through the screen. This performative support from someone who had never said two genuine words to me. Aunt Marie called from her number and actually left a voicemail, and I listened to it, even though I knew I should not, and her voice was strained as she said, "Emma, honey, your mother just saw the news about your award, and she's beside herself. She had no idea. We all had no idea. Why didn't you tell us something this important was happening? She really wants to talk to you. She's so proud. Please call her back." I deleted the voicemail, and I turned my phone face down on my desk, and I felt this strange calm settling over me. This certainty that I had made the right choice by not reaching out to them, because even now in Aunt Marie's message I could hear the undertone of accusation, the implication that I had done something wrong by not including them in my achievement, as if I owed them access to my life after they had spent years making it clear that nothing I did mattered. My phone kept buzzing with texts and calls and social media notifications throughout the rest of the afternoon, and I ignored all of the family attempts at contact and responded warmly to everyone else, and I felt something I had not felt in years, this deep satisfaction in knowing that they finally saw what they had missed. That they could no longer pretend I was the family failure, that the world was telling them what I had always known, that I was worth something, that I had value, that I had achieved something extraordinary while they were busy celebrating Kyle's mediocrity. I flew to Chicago the morning of the gala, and the entire flight I felt this nervous energy coursing through me, this mixture of excitement and terror that made it impossible to sit still. And I kept checking my phone even though I had put it on airplane mode, kept thinking about my family and their frantic attempts to reach me, and wondering if any of them would somehow show up at the ceremony, even though they had not been invited and did not know the specific venue. The gala was held at the Chicago Art Institute, in the grand ballroom with its soaring ceilings and massive windows overlooking Michigan Avenue, and when I arrived that evening in the emerald green gown I had bought specifically for this occasion, the first formal dress I had owned since college, I felt like I was stepping into someone else's life, someone confident and successful and celebrated. The room was filled with hundreds of people, architects and designers and industry leaders from around the world, all dressed in elegant, formal wear, and I found my assigned table near the front, where Rachel and two of the senior partners from my firm were already seated along with Dr. Chen and his wife. And they all stood when I arrived and hugged me and told me I looked beautiful. And I felt tears threatening and had to blink them back because I could not cry and ruin my makeup before going on stage. The ceremony began with speeches from the competition organizers and the judges, explanations of the selection process and the importance of sustainable design innovation, and then they began announcing the winners in reverse order, starting with third place and working up. And when they called my name for second place, I stood on shaking legs and walked to the stage and accepted the award, a beautiful glass sculpture in the shape of intersecting buildings, along with the oversized check for $100,000 that they presented for the photographers. And I gave my speech that I had practiced dozens of times, thanking Dr. Chen for his mentorship and my firm for their support, and talking about why accessible, sustainable housing mattered, why everyone deserved a safe and environmentally responsible place to live, regardless of their income. And when I finished, the entire ballroom erupted in applause, a standing ovation that went on for what felt like minutes. And I stood there holding my award and feeling this overwhelming sense of validation, of finally being seen for who I actually was and what I could achieve. After the ceremony, there was a reception with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and I spent 2 hours networking, talking with representatives from Chen and Morrison about the partnership development process, being interviewed by journalists from architecture publications, exchanging business cards with senior architects from prestigious firms who wanted to discuss potential collaborations, and I felt like I was floating through it all, like this could not possibly be my real life. During a quiet moment, I stepped into the restroom and took out my phone and took a single photo of myself in the mirror holding the award and the check, and I posted it to Instagram with the caption, "Hard work pays off," and nothing else. No mention of my family, or the years of struggle, or the dinner that had happened 6 weeks ago. Just that simple statement of fact. And I knew my family would see it and know exactly what I was saying, that I had succeeded entirely without them, that their dismissal and their cruelty had not broken me, but had instead freed me to achieve something they could never diminish. My phone started buzzing immediately with new notifications, and I turned it face down and returned to the reception and spent the rest of the evening celebrating with people who actually valued me. And it was not until I got back to my hotel room near midnight that I looked at my phone again and saw that my mother had called 11 more times and my father 7, and Kyle had sent a series of texts ranging from congratulatory to accusatory, asking why I was shutting them out of this achievement. And I turned my phone off completely and went to sleep feeling more peaceful than I had in years. I returned home 2 days after the gala and spent the entire flight scrolling through my phone, looking at the accumulated notifications that I had been ignoring, and when I finally counted them, I realized there were 47 missed calls from my mother, 23 from my father, and dozens of texts from extended family members, Everyone suddenly desperate to reach me now that I had achieved something they could not dismiss or minimize. I felt nothing looking at those numbers except a distant curiosity about what they might say, what words they might use to try to reclaim access to my life after they had spent years making it clear that nothing I did mattered unless it reflected well on them. I deleted most of the texts without reading them, but I did respond to my father with a single message that said, "I'm willing to meet with you alone for coffee this week." And within minutes he replied agreeing to Thursday afternoon at the cafe near my apartment. And I knew he would show up because he always did what he was told, whether by my mother or now by me. Thursday came, and I arrived at the cafe first and ordered my coffee and sat at a corner table watching the door. And when my father walked in, he looked older than I remembered, more tired. His shoulders slumped in a way that might have made me feel guilty 6 weeks ago, but now just made me feel sad for him. Sad that he had spent 30 years enabling my mother's cruelty and favoritism, instead of standing up for what was right. He sat down across from me and started talking immediately, saying, "Emma, your mother wants you to know she's so proud of you. She had no idea you were working on something this important. She wishes you had told her." And I held up my hand to stop him and said, "Dad, I didn't tell her because she made it clear over and over that my work didn't matter to her, that nothing I achieved would ever be as important as Kyle's mediocrity, and I wasn't going to give her the opportunity to diminish something I had worked so hard for." He looked down at his coffee cup and said, "You know how your mother is? She doesn't always express things well, but she loves you." And I felt that old familiar anger rising, and I kept my voice calm as I said, "That's not good enough anymore, Dad. Loving me is not the same as valuing me, and I've spent 28 years accepting scraps of attention and approval while watching Kyle get celebrated for doing the bare minimum, and I'm done with that dynamic." He tried to interrupt, and I kept talking, saying, "I'm open to rebuilding a relationship with both of you, but only if things genuinely change. No more comparing me to Kyle, no more dismissing my accomplishments, no more financial double standards where he gets thousands of dollars handed to him while I get lectured for asking for grocery money. And if you can't accept those conditions, then I'll be fine on my own because I've finally learned that my worth doesn't depend on whether you recognize it." My father sat silently for a long moment and then said, "I'll talk to your mother. I'll explain what you need. I can't promise she'll change, but I'll try." And I nodded and said, "That's all I'm asking. Just try, and we'll see what happens." And I meant it. I was genuinely open to reconciliation if they could meet me halfway. But I also knew that I no longer needed them to complete me, or validate me, or make me feel worthy. We finished our coffee and hugged goodbye, and I walked home feeling lighter than I had in years. And that evening I sat at my drafting table working on preliminary sketches for the next phase of the sustainable housing project, the partnership with Chen and Morrison that would start next month. And I looked around my small apartment with its second-hand furniture and its walls covered in my own architectural drawings, and I felt genuinely happy, genuinely peaceful, genuinely free from the weight of seeking approval from people who had never been capable of seeing me clearly. I had wasted so many years trying to earn love that should have been freely given, trying to prove my worth to people who had decided long ago that Kyle was the child who mattered, and I was just the disappointing afterthought. But winning that prize had taught me something more valuable than the money or the recognition. It had taught me that my value existed independent of their acknowledgement, that I could build a meaningful life and career based on my own abilities and the support of people who actually believed in me. I was open to my parents being part of my future if they could genuinely change, if my mother could learn to celebrate my achievements without comparing them to Kyle's, and my father could learn to stand up for equity instead of enabling favoritism. But I no longer needed them to be part of that future. I was complete on my own, validated by my work and my integrity, and my hard-won understanding that the only approval I truly needed was my own. The phone calls from my mother continued for another week and then gradually stopped, and I heard through Aunt Marie that my parents were giving me space, which probably meant my mother was hurt that I had set boundaries, and my father did not know how to bridge the gap. But I felt no guilt about it, only a calm certainty that I had done the right thing. 3 months later, my mother sent a card in the mail with a short note that said, "Congratulations on your achievement. I hope we can talk soon." And I called her, and we had a stiff, awkward conversation where she tried to act like nothing had happened, and I gently reminded her of my conditions, and she said she would think about it, and I accepted that this might be as good as it got, that some people could not change even when confronted with the consequences of their actions, and I was at peace with that reality because I had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that I could not control how other people valued me, but I could absolutely control how I valued myself, and I chose to value myself highly, to celebrate my own achievements, to build relationships with people who saw my worth clearly and consistently, and to never again accept crumbs of approval from people who should have been offering me unconditional love.